Trey Jameson's feet slapped against the pavement as he raced through the streets of the Oakview neighborhood. His faded sneakers barely held together, the threads threatening to split apart with each step. Trey didn't care. He had one goal in mind today. Just like every day after school, helping Mr. Grayson. He rounded the corner, slowing down as the familiar sight of the old veteran's house came into view. The small bungalow was tucked away at the end of the block, worn and battered by time like its owner. The lawn was overgrown, weeds creeping through the cracks in the driveway. But Trey didn't notice those things anymore. His focus was always on Mr. John Grayson, the man who sat outside his house in a battered old wheelchair, staring into the distance with eyes that carried stories no one else in the neighborhood seemed to care about. "Hey, Mr. Grayson," Trey shouted, raising a hand as he approached. The veteran's head turned slowly, and his gaze locked on the boy. His face remained expressionless, but Trey could see the faintest flicker of recognition in those tired eyes. Grayson didn't say much most days actually. He hardly ever spoke at all, but that didn't stop Trey from visiting. "You need help with anything today?" Trey asked, resting his hands on his knees to catch his breath. Grayson's grizzled face softened ever so slightly, his lips pressing into a tight line that resembled a smile. He nodded once, and that was all the confirmation Trey needed. Grabbing the rake that leaned against the side of the house, Trey set to work on the patch of garden that Mr. Grayson had once tended meticulously. These days, the garden was just a tangled mess of wild grass and stubborn weeds, but Trey didn't mind the effort. He enjoyed the quiet moments spent in Mr. Grayson's presence, even if the man didn't say much. As he worked, Trey glanced over his shoulder occasionally, watching the veteran as he sat silently, his right leg ending abruptly just below the knee. The prosthetic was old and clunky, something that looked uncomfortable and inadequate for someone who had clearly given so much in service to his country. "What was it like, over there?" Trey asked one afternoon as he pulled up a particularly stubborn patch of weeds. Grayson didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted toward the sky, his expression distant. Trey had learned not to push too hard when he asked these kinds of questions, but he was always curious about the man's past, about the war that had taken so much from him. "Hot," Grayson finally muttered, his voice rough from disuse. "Real hot." He added again, for emphasis. Trey nodded, sensing the end of the conversation. That was how most of their talks went, short, clipped, with Grayson offering little glimpses into a life Trey could only imagine. Despite the brevity of their exchanges, Trey felt a connection to the old man that went beyond words. His mother didn't understand it. She often warned him about spending too much time with Mr. Grayson. "That man's seen too much, Trey," she'd say while stirring a pot of soup in their cramped kitchen. "He's broken. Ain't no way you can fix him." Trey never argued. His mother worked hard, pulling double shifts at the hospital, and he didn't want to add to her worries. But deep down, he knew there was something more to Mr. Grayson, something worth understanding. His mother might see a broken old man, but Trey saw someone who'd given up so much, someone who still had stories to tell, even if they were locked behind walls of silence. Each day after school, Trey would stop by Mr. Grayson's house, bringing whatever he could scrounge up, sometimes groceries, sometimes old clothes his mother had set aside to donate. He'd help with the yard, fix small things around the house, and on the best days, Grayson would share a few more cryptic memories about his time in Afghanistan. "I had friends," Grayson said one day, his voice unusually soft. "Good men. Not all of them came back." Trey didn't press for more. He didn't need to. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air between them. Months passed, and Trey's visits became routine. Grayson had come to expect the boys' company, and though he never said it, Trey could tell that the old man appreciated the time they spent together. There was a comfort in their shared silences, in the rhythm of the mundane tasks they did side by side. One afternoon, as Trey helped sort through a pile of old junk in Mr. Grayson's garage, he came across a box marked with faded military symbols. Curious, he wiped the dust off the lid and peeked inside. Photos, medals, and old letters filled the box, relics of a life that seemed so distant now. "Mr. Grayson, what's this?" Trey asked, holding up a photo of a younger, stronger man in full military gear. The man in the picture was smiling, surrounded by a group of soldiers, their camaraderie evident even through the worn edges of the photo. Grayson glanced at the photo, his face tightening. For a moment, Trey thought the veteran wouldn't say anything, but then he spoke, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "That was my team," Grayson said, his gaze fixed on the photo. Before the explosion. Trey's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard Mr. Grayson speak so openly about the incident that had taken his leg and, in many ways, his life. He waited, knowing that pushing the veteran too hard might close the door on this rare moment of vulnerability. "It was supposed to be a routine patrol," Grayson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't see the IED until it was too late. It went off right under us. Killed 2 of my best friends. I shouldn't have survived." Trey swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Grayson's words settle in his chest. He had known the veteran had been through something terrible, but hearing it firsthand made it all the more real. "Why do you think you survived?" Trey asked, his voice gentle. Grayson's eyes glazed over, lost in a memory Trey couldn't reach. "I don't know," Grayson replied, his voice cracking. "Sometimes I think I shouldn't have," he added with a more bitter tone. For the next few days, the atmosphere between Trey and Mr. Grayson shifted. The veteran seemed quieter than usual, more withdrawn. His brief openness about the explosion that had changed his life seemed to have stirred something painful inside him, something he wasn't yet ready to confront fully. Trey, sensing the change, didn't push. He continued his visits, offering help in whatever way he could. But the conversations were short, the silences longer. One Saturday morning, Trey showed up with a bag of groceries. His mother had given him a bit of extra money, and Trey had spent it on essentials he knew Mr. Grayson needed. As he knocked on the front door, he heard the familiar sound of the veteran's wheelchair creaking toward the entrance. Grayson opened the door slowly, his expression unreadable as his eyes flickered to the bag in Trey's hand. "Got you some stuff from the store," Trey said cheerfully, holding up the groceries as if to brighten the heavy mood. Grayson's eyes softened, and he nodded once before rolling back to let Trey inside. The house was dimly lit, cluttered with remnants of a life lived mostly in solitude. Trey placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and began unpacking them while Grayson wheeled himself to the small table by the window. As Trey finished, he noticed the same box from the garage sitting on the table next to Grayson. The box of memories, of secrets. Grayson's hands rested on the edges of the box, his fingers tracing the worn cardboard as if he were deciding whether or not to open it again. "I don't deserve any of this," Grayson muttered, his voice so low that Trey almost didn't catch it. Trey turned, frowning. "What do you mean?" Grayson's gaze remained fixed on the box. "I shouldn't be here, Trey. The men who died that day, they were better soldiers than me, better men, but I'm the one who made it out. And for what? To sit in this house, rotting away?" Trey didn't know what to say at first. He'd never heard Mr. Grayson talk like this before, and the raw pain in his voice was unsettling. "You didn't do anything wrong," Trey said softly. "It wasn't your fault." Grayson's eyes met Trey's, and for the first time, the veteran's stoic mask cracked. "Wasn't it? I was in charge of that patrol. I should have seen the signs, should have protected my men, but I didn't. And now I'm just a broken old man who can't even walk." Trey swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of Grayson's guilt pressing down on both of them, suffocating the air in the room. But Trey wasn't ready to let the veteran sink back into the darkness that had clearly been swallowing him for years. "You've still got a lot to give," Trey said, his voice firmer this time. "Look, I don't know much about war or what you went through, but I know you don't have to go through it alone. You've got people who care about you." Grayson shook his head, his expression full of disbelief. "Who? The world doesn't care about broken soldiers, Trey. They send you off to fight. And when you come back like this," he gestured to his missing leg, "they forget about you." Trey bit his lip. He didn't have all the answers, but he wasn't going to let Mr. Grayson sink into that despair. Not if he could help it. "I care," Trey said quietly. "You're not alone." Grayson's hand trembled slightly as he looked down at the box. After a long pause, he reached inside and pulled out a medal, the dull metal glinting in the weak light of the room. "They gave me this," Grayson said, his voice thick with bitterness. "For bravery. for surviving. But every time I look at it, all I see are the men who didn't. Trey stared at the medal, feeling the heavy weight of it even though it wasn't in his hands. He had never seen a military medal up close before, but he knew what it symbolized: sacrifice, bravery, and, in Grayson's case, an unresolved guilt that had haunted him for years. Maybe, Trey hesitated, choosing his words carefully, maybe you survived for a reason. Maybe you're supposed to do something with your life. Something important. Grayson laughed bitterly, shaking his head. I've done enough. Trey wasn't convinced. He could see the pain in Grayson's eyes, the way his body slumped under the weight of his memories. But he also saw a man who still had a lot to offer the world. Trey didn't know what that might be, but he believed it with every fiber of his being. You're still here for a reason, Trey said quietly. I don't know what it is, but I think you'll figure it out. Grayson didn't respond, but Trey saw the slightest flicker of hope in the veteran's eyes. Maybe it was a start. A week later, Trey arrived at Grayson's house to find the old man sitting on the porch, a letter in his lap. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he clutched the paper. Something was wrong. Mr. Grayson? Trey called as he approached. You okay? Grayson didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the letter, his expression grim. When Trey reached him, the veteran finally looked up, his face unreadable. What's that? Trey asked, glancing at the envelope. Grayson handed it to him without a word. Trey took the letter and read the return address, the Veterans Administration. Trey's heart sank. He'd heard about the problems veterans faced with getting proper care, about how some were forgotten, left behind by the system. He quickly scanned the contents of the letter, his brow furrowing as he read. It was about a government grant, one that Mr. Grayson was eligible for, money that could pay for a new prosthetic leg, better medical care, even some financial assistance. But there was a catch. It required documentation, proof of Grayson's military award, the very medal that now sat in the dusty box in his garage. This is good news, right? Trey asked, trying to understand why Grayson looked so upset. Grayson shook his head. It's not that simple. Trey frowned. But you have the medal. You can show them. Grayson's eyes clouded over with a mixture of anger and regret. I don't want their money. I don't want their help. Trey was stunned. Why not? This could change everything for you. You could get a better leg, maybe even walk again. Grayson's jaw tightened. That medal, it doesn't mean what it should. It's not for bravery. It's a reminder of all the things I failed to do. Trey was silent for a moment, trying to process the depth of Grayson's pain. He didn't understand how the man could reject something that might help him, but he also knew that Grayson's past wasn't something he could fully comprehend. What if? Trey hesitated, unsure of how to approach the delicate subject. What if this is your second chance? You survived for a reason, Mr. Grayson. Maybe this is part of that reason. Grayson didn't respond, but Trey could see the internal battle raging within him. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. Think about it, Trey said softly. You don't have to decide right now, but don't throw this away. You deserve better. The days passed slowly after that conversation. Trey continued his visits, but something had shifted between him and Grayson. The veteran seemed more withdrawn, more distant. Trey worried that he might never be able to break through the walls that Grayson had built around himself, but he refused to give up. One afternoon, as Trey was helping Grayson clean out his garage, he noticed the old box of military memorabilia had been moved. It sat in the middle of the room, its lid slightly ajar. Curious, Trey opened it and found the medal resting on top of the other contents. Grayson must have placed it there recently. Trey's heart pounded as he held the medal in his hands. He turned to Grayson, who was watching him from his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. I don't know if I'll ever be able to accept it, Grayson said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to try. Trey smiled, feeling a surge of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new for Mr. Grayson. Maybe, just maybe, the veteran could find a way to heal. It took another few days before Grayson finally agreed to fill out the paperwork. Trey stayed late one evening to help him go through the forms, making sure everything was in order. Grayson was hesitant, his hands trembling as he signed his name at the bottom of the documents. But Trey could sense the weight lifting, ever so slightly. The next step was mailing the forms, and Trey insisted on coming along for the trip. He wanted to be there for this moment, Grayson's first step toward accepting the help he deserved. They took Trey's bike, Grayson sitting in his wheelchair beside him as they made their way to the post office. It was a quiet ride, the cool breeze rustling the leaves as they passed by the familiar houses of Oakview. Trey pedaled slowly, allowing Grayson to roll alongside him at a comfortable pace. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence was different this time. Not the heavy, oppressive kind, but something lighter, more hopeful. At the post office, Trey handed the letter to Grayson, giving him a nod of encouragement. The veteran hesitated for a moment, staring at the envelope as if it were something foreign. But then, with a deep breath, he dropped it into the mailbox. "It's done," Grayson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Trey smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "You did it," he further added. Grayson looked down at his hands, his expression one of quiet disbelief. "I don't know what happens next." Trey rested a hand on the veteran's shoulder. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." For the first time in a long while, Grayson smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was real. The wait for a response from the VA was agonizing. Weeks passed, and Trey could tell that Grayson was growing restless. But something had changed in the veteran. He was more open, more willing to talk about his experiences. Trey learned more about Grayson's time in the military, about the friendships he'd made, and the painful losses he still carried with him. "I didn't think I'd ever talk about it," Grayson admitted one afternoon as they sat on his porch. "But you've made it easier." Trey shrugged, feeling a bit embarrassed by the compliment. "I just listened." Grayson shook his head. "It's more than that. You've given me something to hold on to, a reason to keep going." Trey didn't know what to say to that. He had never thought of himself as someone who could make a difference in someone's life. But hearing Grayson say those words filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. Then, one afternoon, the letter arrived. Trey was at school when Grayson received it. The veteran called Trey as soon as he opened it, his voice filled with an emotion Trey had never heard from him before. "Trey, they approved it," Grayson said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "They're sending someone to fit me for a new prosthetic." Trey grinned so wide his cheeks hurt. "That's amazing, Mr. Grayson. I told you things would get better." Grayson chuckled, and for the first time, it didn't sound forced. "Maybe you were right," he added. The day Grayson was fitted for his new prosthetic leg felt like a turning point. Trey accompanied him to the clinic, watching as the technician worked carefully to measure Grayson's stump and adjust the new leg to fit him perfectly. The process was slow and meticulous, but Grayson was patient, more hopeful than Trey had ever seen him. When the technician finished, Grayson stared at the new leg, his expression a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. "You ready to give it a try?" the technician asked. Grayson hesitated for a moment, then nodded. With Trey's help, he stood for the first time in years, his weight uneven and shaky at first, but he didn't fall. Trey watched in awe as Grayson took a few tentative steps, his movements awkward and uncertain, but each step was a victory. "I can't believe it," Grayson muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm walking again." Trey clapped him on the back, grinning. "You did it, Mr. Grayson. You're back on your feet." Grayson looked down at his new leg, his eyes glistening with tears he quickly wiped away. "I never thought I'd feel this again. I owe you, Trey." Trey shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You did this for yourself." Grayson smiled, his gratitude clear in his expression. But Trey knew there was something more, something deeper that Grayson still wasn't ready to talk about. The secret that Trey had felt lingering beneath the surface ever since they'd met. It was a warm evening when Grayson finally revealed the truth. They were sitting on his porch again, enjoying the peaceful silence that had come to define their friendship. Grayson had been more active since getting his new leg, going on short walks around the neighborhood, even meeting some of the neighbors who had long forgotten about the man who lived in the old bungalow. But tonight, there was a heaviness in the air. Trey could sense that something was on Grayson's mind. "There's something I haven't told you," Grayson said quietly, staring out at the sunset. Trey looked over at him, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" Grayson sighed, rubbing his hands together nervously. "I've been keeping a secret, something I've been ashamed of for a long time." Trey's heart raced. He had always known there was more to Grayson's story, something deeper than just the trauma of war. He waited, giving the veteran space to gather his thoughts. "I wasn't just a soldier," Grayson began, his voice low and filled with regret. I had a family, a wife, a son." Trey's eyes widened in shock. "You never mentioned them." Grayson nodded, his expression grim. "That's because I lost them. After the accident, after I came back like this, I pushed them away. I didn't want them to see me broken. I thought I was doing them a favor." Trey listened in silence, his heart aching for the man beside him. "I've been too proud, too ashamed to reach out," Grayson continued, his voice trembling. "But now I think I want to find them, to see if they'll even talk to me again." Trey swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. He couldn't imagine the pain Grayson had carried all these years, the regret that had eaten away at him. "I think you should try," Trey said softly. "You've come so far, Mr. Grayson. Maybe they're waiting for you to reach out." Grayson looked at Trey, his eyes filled with uncertainty and hope. "You think they'll forgive me?" Trey nodded. "If you show them the man you've become, I think they will." Grayson sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of his decision hanging in the air. But Trey knew that the veteran had taken the first step toward healing the deepest wound of all, the wound left by the family he had lost. Weeks passed, and Grayson found the courage to write a letter to his son, explaining everything. Trey helped him craft the words, encouraging him to be honest, to open his heart in a way he hadn't in years. It was a long shot, but Trey believed in the power of reconciliation, of second chances. One evening, as Trey sat with Grayson on the porch, the veteran received a response. A short, simple note from his son, asking to meet. Grayson was overwhelmed. He showed the letter to Trey with trembling hands, his eyes wet with tears. "He wants to see me." Trey smiled, feeling a surge of joy for the man who had become like a grandfather to him. "I told you they'd forgive you." Grayson nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he stared at the letter. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with hope and the possibility of healing. The meeting with Grayson's son was emotional and difficult, but it was also healing. Grayson apologized for pushing them away, for letting his pride and guilt keep him from the family that had always loved him. His son, now a grown man with a family of his own, forgave him, offering the reconciliation Grayson had longed for. Trey watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride and happiness for his friend. He had been a part of Grayson's journey, helping him find his way back to the people who mattered most. And in doing so, Trey had discovered something important about himself too, that even a small act of kindness could change a life in ways he had never imagined.